So a little bit about a year ago or so, I had a buddy of mine. He's a painter. He painted this engine cover for me, and I thought it was going to look nice and glossy, shiny. And I mean, when he gave it back to me, he put a lot of coats of primer, but he's telling me that you can't paint. Plastic's not meant to be painted. He doesn't know about all that about painting plastic. He's a professional painter, and he puts cars back to stock the way they were. So when I got it, I mean, it looked really good, but if you got up like really close, you could kind of see a little bit of the texture here and there. So I wasn't ever really 100% happy. So after about a year or so, I started doing some research online on how to, properly prep plastic. So what I did is I took a hand sander, palm sander, and I started off with a 120 grit sandpaper, and I sanded the hell out of this thing. Like, I sanded all this with a hand sander, and I did a little bit of this by hand, or a little bit with the sander in here, a little bit by hand. After that, I bumped it up to 220 to try to get all the texture out of here. So I did that with the 220 sandpaper, and I got majority of the texture out of it. Try to make it as smooth as possible, but not perfect. But when I started, since this thing was already painted and cleared, when I sanded all this thing turned all white because of the clear coat, so it wasn't too bad. So then afterwards, after I did the sanding, I cleaned it up, and I used this wax and tar remover to clean it up, and then or you could use dishwashing soap. So the next step I did is I bought this high build primer. It's black. It's called Plasticoat. It's kind of hard to see, because of the light, but it's a high build primer for plastic. And I started spraying it away, and then I used once I sprayed it, I gave it like 2 good coats, and then let it dry for like 20 minutes. But then I used the fan too to speed up the process, and I kind of just taped everything off that I didn't want painted. So after I taped everything off, once it dried, after 20 minutes, the primer, I used a 400 grit sandpaper, wet sand, and I wet sanded all this, and then I washed it again, used the wax and tar remover, let that dry with the fan, and then I also used a compressor to get all these little areas out of here, all these crevices. Did that, dried it off, and then reshot it again, primer again, let it dry, again, do it again with a 400 grit sandpaper. So I did that, like, I had to sand it with a 400 grit sandpaper, wet. I did that about 4 times, or no, actually 3 times. Primered, let it dry, sand with 400, primer again, wash it, primer again, 400. So after about the 3rd time, after I cleaned it off one more time, I sprayed it again, and I bumped it up to 600 grit sandpaper, wet sanding. That's your final step before you paint it. So this is what it looks like, every time you wet sand. Now you can see a lot of these dark areas where I haven't got to it, but it's okay. It's not going to affect anything. But now if you can kind of tell, it's nice and smooth. Every time you wet sand it, it's going to feel a lot smoother. There's no more texture in here no more. That's what that high build primer is for plastic. But I forgot to mention, before I even sprayed it, after I got done sanding it with the 200 grit, once I cleaned it off, I sprayed a adhesive promoter. That's what you need for plastic, so the primer can bite into the plastic. So you want to get some adhesive promoter and spray it. Just do like 2-3 light coats. Don't wet it. You let it flash for about 5 minutes, or you could get the fan. Wait 5 minutes anyway. After those 5 minutes, after you let it flash, you take your can again, shake it up really good, and do a nice wet coat. You want to do a nice, really nice wet coat everywhere. And you let it flash for about 15 minutes. I had the fan going on. after those 15 minutes are over, that's when you could start, that's when you could shoot the high build primer. So anyway, this is about the first wet sand with the 600 sandpaper. I'm just going to reshoot it one more time with the high build primer, let it dry for 20 minutes, and then I'm going to wet sand it one more time with the 600, and that's it, I'm done. I'm going to hand it over to my buddy, and after this, he's going to shoot it with a sealer. It's almost like the sealer creates like it pretty much seals the surface, so that you could get any little imperfection out of here. So once he seals it and lets that dry, he's going to shoot it with, gloss black paint, and then afterwards he could clear it. And the first time he did this for me, he had to tape he did all this little detail, he taped everything off, and I told him not to. I read online, this guy, all he did is he painted this entire thing and then he cleared it, and then he took a little airbrush and he just filled all this in, and he just took like some reducer or something, cleaned off the excess overspray, and then he cleared it one more time, and that was it. So we'll see how this turns out. And I did the same thing. I did the same steps for aerated cold air intake that I had. He had painted that for me too, but it looked like shit, because you could see all the rough texture on there. All he did, my buddy, when I handed it to him about a few months ago, he just scuffed it up, but I didn't really like it, so I just recently did that, and I'm going to post up a video with that, with that cold air intake. I did the same process with this. I sanded the shit out of it with 120 and then 220, and then after that I used the adhesive promoter, and then after that I did the primer, wet sand with 400, clean it off, primer it again, 400 grit wet sand, and then washed it and then sprayed it again. Did that about 3 times, and then afterwards I did it 2 times with the 600 for the final, and then gave it to my buddy and he sealed it and he painted it, and it looks really sharp. It looks like glossy, like automotive paint, just the way it should have came out in the first place. So he told me he never wanted to do this ever again, but I'm gonna make him. So we'll see how that turns out.